In the first part of The Art of Illustration, we covered about 17 centuries and the innovations in printing which took us from here to here and finally here. But of course we know far more about recent times than the distant past. So this time we'll only be covering not much more than a century in about the same amount of time. As the 20th century began, illustrators continued to revel in the newfound freedoms brought about by offset lithography. And while the period didn't produce any innovations, it did produce some striking illustration both in colour and monochrome. A lot of the work produced seemed to express a mood of nostalgia. This was only to be expected in the fairy tale worlds evoked so convincingly by the likes of Arthur Rackham and Edmund Dulac. And a romantic ruralism was certainly obvious in the meticulous watercolour illustrations of Beatrix Potter. But the same mood permeated images aimed at adults too. Even when selling something as irrefutably modern as the motor car, few were prepared to accept this was becoming a mechanised age. Perhaps it was the prevailing influence of Alphonse Mucha, but it did appear that tradition and nature were the dominant themes. There was one area where this wasn't the case. Comic strips at the time were primarily for adults and appeared in newspapers across Europe and particularly America. In the States, Fred Opper produced some revolutionary stylized cartoons which contrasted sharply with the anatomical precision of what had previously been seen. But the artist who did more than any other to revolutionize the cartoon was George Herriman. He created the strip Crazy Cat, which featured outrageously loose characters in a desolate environment. The strip was defined by surreal visual humour which played with concepts of time and space and was based around an inherently violent love story. This was also a period of global political unrest, with any number of territorial squabbles going on at any given time. And finally these squabbles coalesced into the First World War in 1914. And on both sides of the conflict, illustration was co-opted into playing a role. It was used as a psychological weapon to recruit men into the armed forces, to keep society going in their absence, and of course to depict the enemy as vicious barbarians. When this sorry episode ended in 1918, it soon became clear that the war had swept away one way of living and brought about another. And as we entered the 20s, there was a broad acceptance of, and even enthusiasm for, modernity. This was most obvious in the design movement known as Art Deco. And in illustration, A.M. Cassandra was rightly the most celebrated Art Deco stylist. More than anyone else, he pushed at the boundaries of geometrical approaches to image making and still managed to preserve a broad aesthetic appeal in his work. Although Ludwig Hohlwein's illustration work was considerably less geometric, it showed similar interest in the aesthetics of minimalism and the potential of posterized colour. These two illustrators clearly led the field, but many others followed suit, and other than the odd exception, Deco and modernism appeared to have triumphed on a global scale. Even America and Japan came under its spell. Both live-action movies and animated films were born of the late Victorian age, but by the 20s they had come to dominate the world of entertainment. And because photography still had some catching up to do, it was almost exclusively illustrators who produced the film posters. Predictably, most were as crudely melodramatic as the films they promoted, but occasionally potent images were created which rival anything before or since. This poster for Fritz Lang's Metropolis being a case in point. And this striking, if racist, poster for the first ever sound movie in 1928 shows just how radical illustration could be. The 20s also saw the arrival of the first animated star of the silent movie era. Felix the Cat was little more than a series of circles and tubes, which looked nothing like a cat, but was effectively the template on which many others, including Mickey Mouse, would be based. All animated characters have to be created first as illustration, and similar to the demands of the comic strip, must be capable of any number of poses and emotive facial expressions. We've seen how earlier, but not much earlier, children's books were largely backward-looking in terms of both content and style. But in 1928, children's illustrator Van der Gogh published the book Millions of Cats. This is now recognised as the first modern picture book, and with some justification. Gone was the formal relationship between typography and image. Instead, the book was driven by the stylistically naive but playful illustrations, and the words were only there in support. But like Lear before her, it would be some time before anybody else cottoned on to this idea. From an illustration perspective, the 30s saw little change, but all aspects of illustration continued to flourish. America's flirtation with deco and geometry turned out to be brief, and in the mid-30s a new giant of illustration first appeared in the form of Norman Rockwell. His remarkably skillful paintings were unapologetically traditional in their approach, but it was his unerring ability to make you believe the scenarios he depicted which endeared him to all America and much of the rest of the world. Such was his popularity that other exceptional American illustrators of the period tend to be overlooked. The incredible pen and ink work of magazine illustrator Lee Conry being just one example of this effect. 1938 saw the entrance of Superman, originally created by Joel Shuster and Jerry Siegel. The drawing wasn't up to much, and the dynamic compositional potential of the medium was yet to be realised. But credit where it's due. These were the first tentative steps towards what was to become a whole new popular art form in its own right. In the same year, Disney released Snow White, the first colour feature-length animation. And in addition to animators, there were hundreds of concept artists, character designers, storyboard and layout artists, and background illustrators. The quality of background art in Disney films became something of a trademark, and went a long way to make Disney's dream of a motion fairy tale book come true. But a year later the world was at war once again, and this time there really were good guys and bad guys. Hitler's chief of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had orchestrated a relentless campaign which dehumanized and vilified Jewish people and glorified traditional German nationalism. The propaganda response from the Allies during the war ranged from the saintly and heroic images of noble warriors through to the comic mockery of the enemy and their leaders. Eventually in 1945 the good guys won, and everybody tried to return to normal life. America's visual identity continued to be shaped largely by representational illustration when it wasn't being shaped by photography. Rockwell was still the leading light of all things American, but as with Holbein and Cassandra in the 20s and 30s, many others in the States emulated the technique with varying degrees of success. One of the most successful was Albert Dorn. Like Rockwell, he could draw and paint exceptionally well, and used composition and the isolation of characters with equal success. Russian-born Boris Artzybashev applied his prodigious talent to a more surreal, darkly humorous approach, involving the distortion of characters and frequently the morphing of them into machine-based hybrids. Although popular at the time, he remains relatively unknown compared to his more mainstream contemporaries. In Europe, we tried desperately to cling to abstraction and geometry, but at best it could only be considered a rerun of the 20s and 30s. Occasionally illustrators with more distinctive and expressive styles, such as Edward Ardizoni and the massively influential Ronald Searle, broke the mould. But it did seem there was nowhere new left to go. Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are was published in 1963 and was a real shot in the arm for picture books and by association illustration in general. It was an immediate success across the world and remains a milestone of children's illustration. The Three Robbers by Tommy Ungerer was actually published a year before, but tends to get overlooked because of the shadow cast by Sendak's success. It was more stylistically challenging and recalled the radical approaches of both Edward Lear and George Herriman. Ungerer is an interesting case, not just because he represented an antidote to Rockwell and his disciples. He was able to float freely across a wide area of the media without compromise. There are press ads, magazine work and high-profile posters, as well as his children's books and notorious outings into Beardsley-influenced pornographic imagery. 1967 saw the arrival of hippie culture, and for illustration this was a brief but significant flowering of brightly coloured psychedelic imagery created in the main to support the music and underground lifestyle of the era. And it looked for a while that it just might be a style revolution equal to Art Deco, but it didn't translate well into the mainstream, and by the early 70s the flame had pretty much gone out. The years that followed constitute something of a wilderness for good illustration. Despite what the hippies had tried to do, there was no getting away from the fact that it was now a postmodern world and the best you could do was reinvent the wheel. And photography had overtaken illustration as the dominant means of visual expression in the media. But you can't photograph what doesn't exist, so fantasy art of all kinds flourished. Science fiction books, comics, and kids' picture books weren't after all concerned with reality. Frank Frazetta was the yardstick by which all of the fantasy artists were measured. His muscle-bound heroes and heroines were remarkably well evoked, both in colour and monochrome. He's best known for the many book covers he produced, which were invariably dynamically composed and believable despite the impossible nature of his subjects. His influence can clearly be seen in contemporary comic books and game concept art. At the other end of the style spectrum there was the clear line style, best represented by the Dutch illustrators Joost Swaarder and Eva Merlin. It wasn't exactly original, as it owed an immense stylistic debt to Hergé's Tintin and the early comics such as Crazy Cat. But its unpainted mechanical approach has proved to be an enduring one. In the year 1984, few of George Orwell's dire predictions had actually come to pass, even if Ridley Scott used this concept in his TV ad for the Apple Mac computer. The personal computer was of course a revolution which has come to equal if not surpass Gutenberg's printing press. But as with colour printing in the 19th century, not everyone was convinced. So even into the 90s, successful illustration, such as the comic book work of Frank Miller and Mike Mignola, and Josh Kirby's Discworld book covers, were produced traditionally. Ironically, even in early computer games, concept art was predominantly hand-drawn and painted. But digital means evolved more rapidly than anyone would have thought possible. And the device that has hammered the last nail into its tradition's coffin is the graphics tablet and stylus, a computer screen you can draw and paint directly onto. There will probably always be room for hand-rendered illustration, just as there are still people thatching roofs in rural England. But most illustrators working today can't even remember a time when there weren't computers, and paper and paint are almost prehistoric tools. To end the art of illustration, I can think of no better way than to put together a cross-section of contemporary illustrations found online. If nothing else, they demonstrate that illustration still has its uses, and that illustrators will always rise to the challenge of whatever technological advance is thrown their way.